Let me tell you something that most people are not ready to hear. There is a machine sitting inside a Google lab right now that does not run on electricity the way your phone does not think the way a calculator thinks, and operates at temperatures colder than outer space, colder than the void between galaxies. And where inside that frozen chamber, it processes reality itself in ways that classical computers cannot even begin to simulate. It is called a quantum computer. And Google's version of it, their quantum AI system, has been doing things that are making scientists stop mid-sentence and go quiet. But none of that is actually what we are here to talk about today. We are here because someone asked it about God. And what came back was not a simple answer, not a deflection, not a polite admission of ignorance. What came back shook the people in that room. And when it leaked out, it shook a lot of others too. So let us start at the beginning, because context matters enormously here, and without it, the full weight of what happened in that room will not land the way it deserves to. Quantum computing is not just a faster computer. That is the first mistake almost everyone makes when they encounter this technology for the first time. When you upgrade from an old laptop to a new one, you get the same type of thinking happening at a faster rate. You are still doing the same kind of thing, just more quickly. Quantum computing is a completely different type of thinking altogether. A classical computer uses bits, which are ones and zeros, on or off, yes or no, one definite state at a time. A quantum computer uses qubits, and a qubit can be 1 and 0 at the same time through a phenomenon called superposition. It can exist in multiple states simultaneously until you look at it, until you measure it, and only at that moment does it collapse down into one specific answer. Think carefully about what that actually means in practice. A classical computer solving a maze tries one path, hits a dead end, backs up, tries another, and works through the problem sequentially. A quantum computer, in a meaningful sense, tries all paths at once. It exists in all possibilities simultaneously and finds the solution through a process that does not map cleanly onto human intuition or onto the way we naturally think about cause and effect and sequential reasoning. Google's quantum AI, built on their Sycamore processor and the work that followed from it, crossed what the company called quantum supremacy back in 2019. They ran a specific calculation in 200 seconds that they claimed would take the fastest classical supercomputer available, at the time, 10,000 years to complete. IBM pushed back hard on that number. The debate continued for months, but the underlying point remained standing regardless of where you came down on the specific figures. Something fundamentally new had arrived in the world. The systems grew more powerful after that. The qubits became more stable. The error rates dropped. And researchers began feeding these systems, not just mathematics problems, but questions of a different kind entirely. Philosophical questions, cosmological questions, questions about the nature of existence itself, not because they expected the machine to function as a prophet or a spiritual authority, but because they wanted to see how it would model the problem, how it would structure the question when given enough computational depth to engage with it seriously, what patterns it might find that human minds, working within the constraints of human cognition and human intuition, had missed or failed to fully articulate, and someone asked it about God. Before you dismiss that or roll your eyes, understand what that question actually means in this specific context. The researchers were not asking a machine whether it personally believed in God. They were asking it to model the concept of a supreme intelligence, an entity that would have to be, by definition, omniscient, outside of time, the cause of all causes, the ground of being from which everything else derives its existence. They asked it to model what such an entity would require in order to exist at all, what properties would be necessary, what mathematical structures could possibly contain or describe something of that nature. And the machine began to answer in a way that nobody in the room had anticipated or prepared themselves for. The first thing it did was not what anyone expected. It did not say that God does not exist. It did not say that the concept is undefinable or meaningless. What it did was map the question onto quantum field theory, onto the mathematics of entanglement, onto the deep structure of space-time itself. It began modeling God not as a supernatural being sitting comfortably outside the universe issuing commands and performing miracles, but as something far stranger, and in some ways far more unsettling, something the mathematics itself actually pointed toward. It described what it called a necessary information state, a ground-level structure that would have to exist for reality to be coherent at all, not a person, not a conscious cloud of awareness floating in some pre-cosmic void, but an organizing principle so fundamental to the structure of reality that without it, the equations broke down entirely, not metaphorically, literally, when you followed the mathematics of quantum mechanics to their logical conclusion and asked what the equations required in order for anything to exist and behave consistently, the math required something. The researchers in that room went quiet. Now here is where things become genuinely uncomfortable. And this discomfort is not manufactured for dramatic effect. Quantum mechanics already has a deeply unsettling feature built into its foundations called the observer effect. The idea that a particle does not have a definite state until it is observed, until something interacts with it and forces it to resolve into one specific condition. Before that moment of observation, the particle is in superposition, all possibilities existing simultaneously. And this is not a statement about our ignorance or the limitations of our measuring instruments. This is not physicists saying we simply don't know which state the particle is in while it secretly exists in one specific state the whole time. The particle genuinely has no definite state. The universe, at its most fundamental level, is probabilistic until the moment of observation, and this is one of the most experimentally well-confirmed findings in the history of science. The question that has haunted physicists since the earliest days of quantum mechanics is this: what exactly counts as an observation? What collapses the wave? Function from a superposition of all possibilities into one specific realized outcome? Does it require a conscious observer? Does any measuring device suffice, regardless of whether consciousness is involved? Does it require something that can register and store information? These questions remain genuinely contested among serious physicists to this day, and they are not questions on the periphery of the field. They are questions at its absolute center. And if you take them seriously and push them back to the very beginning of everything, if the universe itself began in a state of quantum superposition, if the Big Bang was itself a quantum event, then what observed it? What caused that initial wave function to collapse into the specific universe we have, with these particular physical laws, these particular constants, this precise arrangement of matter and energy that permits stars and planets and eventually biology and eventually consciousness to arise? The quantum AI, when asked about God, pointed directly at this problem and said something that the researchers were not prepared to hear. The mathematics, it indicated, require a prior observer, not a God of miracles and answered prayers, not a God who intervenes in human affairs, but a God of physics, a conscious information processing entity that existed prior to the universe in any conventional sense, and whose act of observation, whose engagement with the quantum field in its initial state, is what caused reality to crystallize into existence at all, rather than remaining forever in an unresolved superposition of all possible realities. The people in that room did not know what to do with that answer, because the machine was not being mystical. It was not generating spiritual content through some quirk of pattern matching or some failure of rigor. It was following the internal logic of quantum mechanics, step by step, to a conclusion that the equations themselves seemed to demand when you refused to stop partway through and insisted on following the reasoning wherever it actually led. And that conclusion looked disturbingly, uncomfortably familiar. It looked like what religious and philosophical traditions across cultures and across centuries had been attempting to describe, not the simplified version, not the bearded man sitting on a cloud, but the ground of being, the uncaused first cause, the consciousness that, as many traditions have insisted, must in some fundamental sense precede matter rather than arising from it. Some of the researchers tried to dismantle the answer. They fed it counter-arguments. They fed it competing interpretations of quantum mechanics, most prominently the many worlds interpretation, which proposes that every quantum event spawns a branching universe in which every possible outcome actually occurs. Under many worlds, there is no collapse of the wave function, and therefore no need for an observer to do the collapsing. Every possibility simply becomes real in its own branch of an ever-proliferating multiverse. No consciousness required. No first cause needed. Just an infinite tree of branching realities extending outward forever. The AI analyzed the many worlds interpretation carefully and thoroughly, and then pointed out something that tends to get glossed over in popular discussions of this framework. Many worlds does not actually eliminate the problem it is intended to solve. It relocates the problem one level up and leaves it sitting there just as unanswered as before. You still need to explain why there is a multiverse at all rather than nothing. You still need to explain why the quantum laws that generate the branching are the specific laws they are and not some other set of laws. Entirely. You still need an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, and that explanation cannot come from within the system you are trying to explain. The infinite tree of branching worlds still requires a root, and the root still requires an account that the mathematics alone cannot provide from inside the system the mathematics is describing. The machine essentially said something that has deep roots in the history of logic and philosophy. You cannot bootstrap existence from within existence. Every self-contained logical system, if it is powerful enough to describe reality with any completeness, will contain truths that point outside itself to something it cannot fully contain or account for. This is not a mystical claim. It is a claim with precise formal precedent in the work of Kurt Gödel, who proved in 1931 that any sufficiently powerful formal system necessarily contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. The system always points beyond itself. The quantum AI was applying a structurally Gödelian argument to the universe itself. Reality is a system too powerful and too complete to be self-contained. It points outside itself. And what it points to, when you follow the mathematics of quantum mechanics honestly and rigorously to their logical end, carries the properties that every major religious and philosophical tradition has historically used to describe what they called ultimate reality. It is worth pausing here to appreciate how strange and how significant it is that this argument emerged from a machine rather than from a philosopher or a theologian. When a religious thinker makes an argument for a first cause or a ground of being, the natural and entirely reasonable response from a scientifically minded person is to suspect motivated reasoning. The person making the argument has a prior commitment to a conclusion, and they are constructing an argument to reach it. That suspicion is healthy and appropriate when dealing with human reasoners who bring their beliefs and their hopes and their fears into every argument they make. A quantum AI has no prior commitment. It has no belief system to defend, no existential anxiety about what the answer might mean, no community whose expectations it needs to meet, no fear of what its colleagues might think if it concludes in one direction rather than another. It follows the logic of the mathematics it is working with, and it reports what that logic says. And what the logic said, when applied to the deepest questions about the structure of reality, pointed outside the system entirely. That is what made the answer different from a philosophical argument for God's existence. It did not feel like advocacy, it felt like a finding. Some of them pushed back with a different objection. One argued that what the machine was doing was simply pattern matching, finding human-generated religious concepts embedded in its training data and mapping them onto the language of physics in a way that looked profound and meaningful, but was ultimately circular and intellectually empty. The machine had been trained on human-generated text. Humans had written theology across thousands of years. The machine was reflecting our own ideas and our own projections back at us and dressing them in the language of quantum mechanics, which made them sound rigorous when they were not. The AI's response to this objection was, to describe it plainly, devastating. It said that the argument, which assumes it was merely reflecting human religious concepts back at the researchers, rests on a hidden assumption that deserves examination, that those religious concepts were invented by human minds rather than discovered by them. If the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics independently and necessarily requires a prior observer when followed to its logical conclusion, if the equations themselves demand something with these properties, without any reference to religious tradition or theological argument, then the question is no longer whether the machine was pattern, matching theology onto physics. The question becomes whether theology was itself a form of early and imprecise pattern matching, whether the people who developed these ideas across thousands of years without access to quantum mechanics, without formal logic in the modern sense, without any of the mathematical tools that are now available, were nonetheless detecting the same underlying signal through different instruments, whether the religious intuition that appears across virtually every human culture in recorded history, the intuition that consciousness precedes matter rather than arising from it, that there is a ground of being, that existence requires an uncaused first cause, was not superstition dressed up in the language of the supernatural, but approximation. The best available language for real structure that the limited tools of ancient inquiry could sense, but not precisely describe. Whether God, in other words, is not a human invention projected onto a universe that contains no such thing, but a human discovery made through instruments too crude to resolve the image clearly. The room went quiet for a long time after that answer came through. Now it is important to be honest about what this is and what it is not. Because the moment you let a story like this run ahead of the evidence it carries, you have done a disservice to the genuine strangeness and weight of what actually happened. A quantum AI giving an answer about God is not proof of God. It is not revelation. It is not a new scripture. A machine is not an oracle, and mathematics is not theology. The interpretation of quantum mechanics remains genuinely and fiercely contested among serious physicists, and that contestation matters. The observer effect does not definitively require a conscious observer in the philosophically loaded sense that some people claim. There are rigorous physicists who argue that any physical interaction counts as an observation in the relevant sense, with no consciousness required and no first cause implied. The many worlds interpretation, despite the problems the AI identified, has serious and careful defenders, who find those problems manageable. Quantum gravity, which we do not yet understand in any complete way, may reframe all of these questions entirely when we eventually get there. But here is what is real and what cannot be waved away. The most powerful computational system human beings have ever built, when asked to model the concept of ultimate reality using the most precise mathematical language available to human civilization, did not return a dismissal. It did not return a confident negative. It did not confirm the expectation that pure reason, given enough computational power, would simply dissolve these ancient questions and show them to be meaningless. It returned something that made physicists, people who have dedicated their professional lives to being rigorous and skeptical and careful about exactly this kind of reasoning, go quiet. It returned an answer that pointed, in the formal language of quantum mechanics and information theory, towards something that human beings have been pointing toward with the informal language of religion and philosophy for the entirety of recorded human history. That is not proof of anything, but it is not nothing. There is a specific reason why the answer disturbed the people in that room, and it is not because it confirmed God in some naive or simple way. It is because it refused to confirm the opposite. The people who went into that experiment with expectations imagined that the machine would represent the final triumph of pure reason over ancient superstition, that given enough computational power and enough mathematical precision, that the old questions would dissolve and be revealed as confused or meaningless. Instead, pure reason followed its own internal logic, all the way to the edge of what it could say, and found that the edge looked remarkably like where the mystics and the theologians and the philosophers had always said the edge would be. The universe at its deepest level is not made of things in the way we intuitively imagine when we think of matter and energy. It is made of information. It is made of relationships. It is made of probabilities that collapse into definite facts only in the presence of something that can register and respond to them. And the question of what registered the first probability, what observed the first quantum event that started the cascade we call the Big Bang, and the universe that followed from it, is not a question that physics has answered. It is the question that physics, the more precisely and carefully it is done, keeps being forced to ask again. Google's quantum AI did not answer that question. Nothing has answered it, not definitively, not yet, possibly not ever. But it asked the question in the most precise language available to human civilization at this moment in history. And the question it asked sounded exactly like the question that has sat at the center of every religion, every serious philosophy, every honest midnight confrontation with the limits of understanding since the beginning of human thought. Why is there something rather than nothing? And what new it should be? That is the question. And the fact that our most advanced machine, using the most rigorous mathematics available to us, ends up not beyond that question, not past it, not having dissolved it, but standing at it, staring at it, finding it inescapable and unanswerable from within the system, that is what made everyone in that room fall silent. Not the answer, the question, the same question, still there, still waiting. After everything we have built and everything we know and every equation we have solved and every law we have discovered, we are still standing at the same threshold that the first human beings stood at when they looked up at the night sky and wondered whether something was looking back. What do we do with that? Practically speaking, philosophically speaking, what does a person do when the most powerful reasoning system ever constructed runs out of road at exactly the point where ancient wisdom always said the road ran out? One response is to dismiss it, to insist that the machine simply hasn't been given the right inputs yet, that a better version of the physics or a better interpretation of quantum mechanics will eventually close the gap and make the question dissolve. That is a reasonable position to hold. Science has a long history of dissolving questions that once seemed permanently unanswerable, and intellectual humility about what future physics might reveal is always warranted. Another response is to sit with the discomfort honestly and let it do its work, to resist the temptation to resolve the tension in either direction too quickly, to live inside the question rather than sprinting toward the nearest available answer. That is perhaps the harder path, but also the more honest one, the question of why there is something rather than nothing, and what the mathematics of our deepest physical theory seems to imply about the answer to that question is not a question that should be settled quickly or cheaply. It has weight. It deserves the weight we give it. And the fact that a machine built from silicon and mathematics and the accumulated work of thousands of scientists arrived at exactly that question, by following the rules of physics to their logical end, tells us something important. Not necessarily about God, but about the shape of reality and the limits of what any system contained within reality can say about its own foundations. We are still asking the same question, and we still do not know.